It started, like most quiet betrayals, on a Thursday. There was nothing special about the day itself, no ominous clouds, no flickering lights to foreshadow the shift coming my way. I was updating the quarterly compliance matrix, eyes buried in federal audit language so dry it could powder paint. That spreadsheet was my usual refuge, a document only a bureaucratic masochist could love. Numbers aligned. Color-coded fields glowed neatly. I was in control. And then the company-wide video alert pinged at the top of my screen. I didn't think much of it at first. Executive updates happened often. A new vendor. A holiday schedule revision. Some poorly designed DI slide deck someone in HR had overpolished. I clicked the link half distracted, still thinking about whether I'd locked in the updated OSHA crosswalk fields. But the screen went black for a second, and then her face appeared. Please welcome our new acting manager, Bianca Weller, the robotic voice of our HR director announced. I blinked, stared, blinked again. Bianca, my wife's younger sister. The same Bianca who once tried to convince our extended family to invest in a blockchain goat farm. The same Bianca who had been banned from our group chat for suggesting Thanksgiving dinner could be tokenized. Now she sat smiling into the webcam like she hadn't just sucker-punched the last thread of normalcy I had left at work. She was 35, full of confidence built in co-working spaces and pitch decks. Her hair was slicked back in that "I'm too busy for hair" way you only get from over-branding your own ambition. Her tone was corporate sugar, sweet, uncomfortably rehearsed. Excited to bring new energy and digital agility to our operations, she said, like she was on Shark Tank. We're going to challenge legacy thinking and move fast. Legacy thinking. I stared at the screen a little longer, then back at the spreadsheet I'd spent 9 hours refining. I wasn't just the compliance officer here. I was the skeleton key that kept this entire place legally operational. I held every single credential that allowed us to function, from SEC registration to federal contractor eligibility to state-by-state licensing. 37 in total. Not that most people in the building knew that. My job wasn't the kind you celebrated. It was the kind you only noticed when it wasn't done perfectly. And I'd done it perfectly for 12 years. But Bianca didn't see any of that. She didn't see certifications or regulatory mastery. She didn't even see a department. She saw a legacy problem. And worse, she saw her brother-in-law, the guy she used to prank with fake parking tickets when she was 19. The one she tried to outshine in family trivia games. In her eyes, I wasn't a professional. I was her sister's husband who somehow wandered into her sandbox. I heard the chuckle before I even looked up. Ricky from IT had been watching too, his screen angled so I could see the same announcement on his monitor. Ain't that your sister-in-law? He asked, half grinning. I gave a slow nod. Yeah. Damn, he muttered. Small world. Too small, apparently. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling like the answers might be etched up there in pencil. There was something about the way the HR director had said, acting manager, that stuck. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't experimental. This was designed. Somebody in that C-suite had pulled the trigger with full knowledge of our connection. My phone buzzed. A message from my wife. Surprise. Isn't it crazy? Bianca didn't even tell me until this morning. But she's really excited about it. Excited? Sure. I typed out a reply, then deleted it. Instead, I just stared at the blinking cursor. There were so many things I wanted to say, but none of them felt safe over text. Not when the lines between personal and professional had just been redrawn in Sharpie. Within the hour, I had 5 emails from Bianca's executive assistant. New reporting structures. A request to submit a list of redundant workflows. A directive to reframe all existing compliance documentation using Agile language. I nearly laughed out loud at that last one. You don't make federal regulations Agile. You don't pivot IRS code. You don't disrupt the Department of Labor. But that was Bianca's brand, tech startup Sparkle, applied recklessly to environments where Sparkle didn't belong. I closed the emails and leaned back in my chair again. My office suddenly felt unfamiliar. Like the walls had shifted a few inches inward. I had always felt invisible in the best way, unbothered, independent, too necessary to touch but too niche to spotlight. That was my power. I was the man behind the curtain. But now, the curtain had been ripped open. And standing there, with a mic and a smile, was Bianca. I looked around the office. At the file cabinets no one else knew how to unlock. At the wall calendar marked with every license renewal deadline for the next 2 years. At the bookshelf filled with code books only I had ever opened. This place was mine. And yet, the weight in my gut told me it wouldn't be for long. I opened my encrypted backup tool and created a new folder. I named it Retirement Photos. Inside, I began transferring copies of every audit trail, every regulatory certification receipt, every signed government communication that bore my digital stamp. I wasn't planning to retire, not really. But I was planning something. Because I'd seen it before, the rise of a new boss who mistook confidence for competence. And I learned a long time ago, when a storm brews, you don't argue with the clouds. You check the exits and make sure your parachute is packed. I glanced once more at Bianca's face frozen in the paused video feed, still grinning like a woman who thought she just won something. She didn't understand the rules of the game she'd just entered. But I did, and I wasn't going to play fair. She didn't see me. Not really. To Bianca, I wasn't a department head, a seasoned professional, or the reason this firm had passed every audit in the last 12 years without a single citation. No. What she saw was a man who got his job because he married into the right family. A legacy hire. That's the phrase she used. Smiled right into it like she was unwrapping some harmless little joke. Only it wasn't harmless. And it wasn't true. We need agility, she said during her first one-on-one with department heads. Digital-first thinking. Lean ops. People who can pivot. Pivot? I'd been holding up the spine of this company since she was still busy uploading LinkedIn selfies with hashtags like #girlboss and #cryptoqueen. The nerve. I didn't pivot. I stabilized. I was the ballast keeping this vessel upright while everyone else chased buzzwords and quarterly optics. But none of that mattered now. Not in her eyes. She'd already decided that I was dead weight. Too comfortable. Too methodical. Too old school. She never even asked what my job actually entailed. Didn't ask how long it took me to negotiate the latest federal recertifications or how I manually drafted the last 3 compliance frameworks from scratch after the software vendor failed us. No, she just talked about acceleration and disruption like they were gospel. She wanted to dismantle the parts of the company that weren't shiny or sexy. And I, apparently, was one of them. Then she brought in Marco. Marco with his tight suit, fake laugh, and zero understanding of regulatory infrastructure. Her old college buddy, a marketing guy turned operations strategist after one too many half-failed startups. I watched him present a slide titled Compliance Vibes, Reimagining Safety during his introductory call. He thought OSHA was a workout class. I'm not exaggerating. He actually joked. So what? We just flex paperwork for the government? And then laughed like he'd made the cleverest joke in corporate history. I wanted to strangle him with my lanyard. That was the moment I knew what Bianca was trying to do. She wasn't improving operations. She was clearing house, replacing institutional knowledge with Instagram-flavored management. If it didn't fit into a pie chart or a Canva deck, it wasn't valuable to her, which meant I wasn't valuable. But there's a funny thing about being underestimated. When people stop looking too closely, they give you space to move freely. To prepare, I started backing up everything. Quietly, methodically. I didn't rush. That would have looked suspicious. I'd done this dance before. Seen how messy things got when power shifted hands too quickly and the details were ignored. So I took my time. Every credential I'd earned on the company's behalf had a digital trail. Every license had a date, a name, a reference code. Every training module I'd passed, every background check I'd cleared, every official certification that carried the company's legal eligibility, it all passed through my hands. I moved the documents one by one, encrypting them, double verifying their timestamps. Then I zipped the entire archive and named it something no one would ever open unless they were me. Retirement photos. It made me laugh. The kind of laugh that didn't quite reach the throat, more breath than sound. Because I knew what I was doing wasn't just petty insurance, it was survival. They were pushing me toward the door and assuming I'd walk out without a sound. But this wasn't a corporate sitcom. There wasn't going to be a clean handoff to some junior analyst. If they wanted my seat, they'd have to reckon with everything that came with it. I didn't mention the backup to anyone. Not to my assistant. Not to IT. Not to my wife. Especially not to my wife. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I didn't trust the version of Bianca she still wanted to believe in. They were sisters, after all. And despite all of Bianca's posturing, there had been a time when she was just the little sister who asked me to proofread her grad school essays, who used to joke that she'd never work in an office because cubicles gave her hives. That version of her was long gone, but nostalgia has a way of painting over the cracks. so I kept my mouth shut and nodded through the alignment meetings. I smiled politely as Marco pitched his new zero-compliance fatigue initiative, which seemed to involve replacing actual safety checklists with emoji-labeled risk meters. I even held the door for Bianca once as she walked into a boardroom wearing a jumpsuit that probably cost more than my first car. But in the background, I was preparing my exit. Not a resignation, no. That would have given them the power. I knew what I was worth, and I wasn't going to walk out like some failed experiment. I wanted them to pull the trigger. I wanted them to believe they were in control, because only then would the consequences feel real. By the second week, I began documenting every change Bianca implemented, every system she bypassed, every policy she rewrote without legal review. I didn't interfere. I simply noted them, saved them, timestamped them, let the data tell its own story. And still, she never asked me for a single insight. Not when the revised safety manual rolled out, with 3 missing sections. Not when Marco's team accidentally archived the entire HR compliance archive during a digital cleanup. Not when a vendor emailed to ask why their access to the federal compliance dashboard had been revoked. She just kept smiling, kept moving, kept mistaking motion for progress. But there's a cost to ignoring the foundations, to gutting the structure without understanding what it holds up. I wasn't just part of the infrastructure, I was the keystone. And while I may not have been flashy, I was precise, measured, necessary. She didn't see it yet, but she would. And when she did, she wouldn't find a graceful way back. Just a zipped folder labeled retirement photos. And a silence that knew exactly what it was worth. The email came at 9:01 a.m. on a Tuesday, sent to the entire company with subject line, Organizational Reimagination Initiative. The sort of title that should come with a drumroll and a disaster warning. I didn't have to open it to know it spelled trouble, but I did anyway. And there it was in all its glossy, HR-approved vagueness. A full departmental reorganization. Every employee, regardless of tenure, title, or contributions, would be required to reimagine their role and reapply for their position. Bianca had officially fired the first shot. Let's be honest, she had said the week prior, leaning back in a leather chair during one of our cold, clock-watching department check-ins. The current structure isn't built for the future. We need to modernize, realign, inject some elasticity. Elasticity, like we were rubber bands, stretched out and flung into some PowerPoint-shaped future. She smiled as she said it, the kind of smile that knew it was about to make someone uncomfortable and relish the anticipation. The interns clapped when the announcement was made over Teams. Of course they did. They thought this meant promotions, movement, opportunity. They didn't realize they were being handed a corporate Hunger Games application. The more experienced staff, they just stared at their screens, or down at their hands, quiet, calculating. I brought nothing to my meeting with her. No resume, no pitch, no colorful one-pager filled with meaningless buzzwords and diagrams about value alignment. Just me, in my usual gray suit, looking her directly in the eye across the glass conference table she'd had installed to replace the oak one we'd used for years. Bianca folded her hands and tilted her head, like she was performing empathy. "James," she said slowly, "you're good. No one doubts that." That was the kind of sentence that always ends with a blade. "But," she continued, "we're looking ahead now, not back. And let's be honest, you're not exactly future-facing. Future-facing." I could have laughed, but I didn't. I just nodded once, slowly. No fight, no rebuttal, because that was the moment I'd been waiting for. The one where she made it official. The one where she said it, on the record. She didn't want me here. I stood without a word, straightened my jacket, and walked out. Not a glance back. Not a goodbye. She expected a defense, maybe even a beg for mercy moment. But I'd already laid my groundwork weeks ago. She was playing poker, thinking she held the winning hand, not realizing I built the table. I stepped into my office and shut the door. The sound of it closing behind me felt different. Heavy. I stared at the bookshelf, the framed certificate from the Department of Labor, the blinking light on the server drive. All of it was mine, but no longer home. Not anymore. That's when I activated Clause 9C. Most people don't bother reading their employment contracts past the vacation policy and benefits section. But I do. I read every word when I was hired. I'd even had a clause added, quietly, under the section titled Termination and Transition Provisions. It was written in clean, sharp legalese, Upon involuntary termination, all company-funded certifications, licenses, and regulatory authorizations assigned to James Langley shall be considered nullified. All legal rights to use, reference, or transfer said certifications shall be void, effective immediately upon signature. It had taken 2 HR rounds to approve, but they'd assumed it was a formality, that I'd never leave, that I was stable, predictable, a relic. They were wrong. I opened my encrypted archive, retirement photos, and began the sequence. 37 licenses, all tied to federal, state, and industry-specific regulations. Each one linked to a digital key that included my biometric signature. And now, each one scheduled for rescission. I didn't notify anyone. No dramatic declarations. No warnings. Just silent efficiency. Because if you're going to burn a bridge, best to make sure the foundation beneath it collapses too. Then I waited. No one came by that day. Bianca was too busy playing disruptor. Marco was probably building some flashy dashboard with zero compliance value. I ordered lunch like normal, logged out at 6 p.m. sharp, and took the elevator down with the same calm I'd had every day since I started here 12 years ago. They hadn't fired me yet, not officially, but they had something planned. You could smell it in the air. And when it came, they'd think they were getting the last word. They had no idea they'd already signed their own disaster. The next morning, I cleared my inbox, printed a few personal photos I'd kept on my desk, none of which showed Bianca, incidentally, and placed them in a slim folder. I left my framed certificates on the wall. Let them think they still had access. Let them pretend it would be business as usual. At 10:06 a.m., I received the calendar invite. Your organizational role review, final discussion. No subject line. No sender. Just HR. I didn't attend. Instead, I walked to the break room, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and took it to the top floor terrace. The city spread out beneath me. Glass towers and concrete resolve. It looked stable, stoic, but it wasn't. Not under the surface. Just like this company. Eventually, the HR liaison, a kid named Jeremy who still wore his intern badge even after a promotion, found me on the terrace. James, he said cautiously, you missed the meeting. No, I said. I just didn't need it. He blinked. There's paperwork. I'm sure there is. He handed it over. I flipped through without looking at the words. I didn't need to. I already knew what it said. I signed on the final page. One clean, cursive loop. I handed it back and walked away. They thought I'd walk out broken, maybe even confused. But I walked out exactly as I planned. Untouched, calm, silent. Because now, the timer had started ticking. It was a Monday morning. Of course it was. Betrayal always likes to wear a suit and carry a clipboard. I arrived like I always did, 8:03 a.m. I was never early enough to make people suspicious, never late enough to give them reason. I'd always timed my entrance so that I passed the same 2 interns in the lobby and exchanged the same dry nod with the front desk manager who never once got my name right. Routine was my armor. But that day, everything was off. Too quiet. No lobby chatter. No echo of clacking heels on marble floors. Just silence, cold tight. When I reached my office door, I noticed it immediately. There was a white envelope slipped beneath the threshold. No postmark. No logo. Just my name written in large, careful block letters. Not even sealed. That told me everything. They didn't want confrontation. They didn't want a scene. They wanted the transition to be quiet, sterile, like clearing old files from a hard drive. And I was the file. I picked it up, flipped it open, and read the single sentence printed in a sterile sans serif font. Effective immediately, James Langley's role has been sunset. Sunset. What a word. Soft. Elegant. Deceptively peaceful. As if they were doing me a favor. As if they hadn't just taken a decade of my life and condensed it into a euphemism. I stood there in my doorway for a full minute, envelope dangling from my fingertips, listening to nothing. No one came by. No phone rang. They thought that by doing it this way, I'd just walk out quietly, file the moment away like some sad footnote. But I wasn't angry. I was ready. I walked into my office, sat in my chair one last time, ran my hands across the grain of the desk I'd polished with the same cloth every Friday before I left. Then I opened the glossy exit packet HR had included. It was stacked with forms, severance, NDA, reiterations, device return instructions, benefits transition plans. It was the kind of packet that gets passed around legal departments like a hot potato before anyone signs it. But I signed it. Without a flinch. Without a pause. Because that signature wasn't surrender. It was ignition. You see, my signature on that exit form triggered a silent chain reaction. The entire certification system I'd spent years crafting and maintaining. Every registration, every federal license, every compliance credential was tied to my name and secured through automated authentication protocols. No one else had access. No one else could transfer it without triggering red flags. And most importantly, no one else could operate the business legally without it. By 6:37 p.m. that evening, the cascade had completed. A quiet, controlled dismantling. My digital credentials were pulled from the national compliance grid. My biometric authorization was revoked from every portal. Automated alerts were triggered at the Department of Commerce, FDA, OSHA, and every state registry we were linked to. All of it gone. Just like that, the company was naked. They didn't even realize it yet. That's the part that still makes me smile. They thought I was just a paper pusher. Just someone who filed things and followed up on inspection dates. They had no idea I had embedded myself so deeply into the infrastructure that removing me was like pulling a power cable from a server room. I didn't gloat. I didn't forward the alerts. I didn't even reply to the inevitable panicked messages I knew would come. I just logged out of my email, shut down my terminal, and walked out with nothing but my keys and a sense of finality that settled deep in my spine. I slept well that night. It wasn't the sleep of a man finally free. It was the sleep of a man who had written the ending of a story with precision and control. A man who didn't have to raise his voice or wave his hands to be heard. I let the silence speak for me. Let the system I built deliver the message I never needed to write in words. You fired the foundation. I didn't dream. No regrets. No bitterness. Just stillness. And in that stillness, a deep, steady satisfaction. The funny thing is, they could have avoided it. All of it. If Bianca had bothered to ask how the systems worked, if Marco had taken one afternoon to actually learn the backbone of our compliance obligations, if anyone, any single executive, had sat down with me for more than 10 minutes over the last 6 months to understand the architecture I built to protect us from ruin. But they didn't. They saw me as furniture, a placeholder. Now they'd feel the draft that came when the walls collapsed. When I woke the next morning, I didn't rush to check my phone, didn't check email. I made coffee, sat by the window, watched the city stir, and I knew, without question, that somewhere downtown, the firm was already starting to fracture. They'd given me silence on the way out, and now they'd get it back in return, but louder. The first glitch arrived at 9:12 a.m. on Tuesday. I wasn't in the office anymore, of course. I was home, still in my robe, coffee in hand, staring out at the skyline with the calm of a man who had just pulled the right pin from the right grenade. I didn't need to be in the building to know what was coming. I had designed the entire system to speak for itself in my absence. And now it had started to speak. It began, fittingly, with a routine client request. The sort of transaction that passed through at least 4 digital verifications before it even landed on someone's desk. It should have cleared in seconds. Only this time, it didn't. It was denied. Invalid documentation. That was the alert. A red banner stretching across the client interface. Not a glitch. Not a lag. A rejection. Hard-coded and absolute. Then came the shipment hold. A container meant for a long-standing pharmaceutical client, one of our highest-paying accounts, was flagged at the Port of Houston. Regulatory oversight, they called it. The documentation tied to the manifest had failed federal verification. The system didn't just delay the shipment. It froze it, held it in limbo. And when they tried to override the hold, the portal kicked back an error they couldn't decipher. Credential chain broken. Verify compliance authorization holder. Bianca, I imagine, still hadn't fully grasped what had happened. I pictured her standing in the center of the office in those expensive block heels she loved, arms folded tight, muttering that it was just a technical issue, as if that phrase could scare a system into submission. And then Ricky, the poor kid from IT, probably sweating bullets, doing his best to explain it. James was the license holder, I imagined him saying, his voice soft but growing more urgent. The federal system's authenticated through his digital keys. Everything is tied to him. Every login, every transaction chain, every third-party validation stamp, it all runs through Langley. And Bianca, in her usual dismissive tone, would have waved it off. Just update the contact info. She probably snapped, assuming the fix was as easy as changing a password. I almost felt bad for Ricky. Almost. Because the systems didn't wave anything off. They didn't respond to optimism or intent or status. They responded to credentials, to traceable, government-verified identities. And I was the only one who held them. Or rather, used to hold them. Now they were ghost entries in a system that wouldn't just forget, wouldn't just reassign. My phone started buzzing around noon. First an unknown number, then 2, then 4. I didn't answer. Let them pile up. I already knew what the voicemails would sound like. Breathless. Half panicked. Maybe polite at first, then gradually sharper. Maybe a friendly request from Bianca. Maybe a formal follow-up from HR. Maybe Franklin himself by the end of the day. But I didn't check. I didn't need to. I poured another cup of coffee and opened the monitoring panel I'd set up before leaving. It didn't breach privacy protocols, not technically. It simply tracked the status of all certifications I had rescinded, a live view of each credential's heartbeat. And by 12:47 p.m., every single one was dark. No pulses, no clearance, no functionality. I refreshed the dashboard and smiled. I wondered what Marco was doing in that moment. Probably trying to redesign the compliance workflow using some Google template. Maybe trying to charm someone at the state licensing board. Or worse, probably asking Lexi, Bianca's assistant, to help him figure out the back-end stuff. That girl once asked if the FDA was a design agency. The systems didn't care about charm or initiative. They cared about verified access, about structure, about legitimacy. You don't talk your way past a federal firewall. You don't vibe your way into regulatory compliance. And now they were finding that out, one locked dashboard at a time. I took my coffee and stepped out onto the balcony. The breeze hit different that day, crisper, like the universe was in on the quiet joke I had just told, and it was laughing with me in the wind. I looked out across the city. Somewhere in that skyline was a conference room full of people scrambling to undo what they didn't understand, desperate to rewire a machine that had been built, line by someone they discarded without reading the manual. My phone buzzed again. This time a text from unknown. Hey James, this is Bianca. Just a few bumps today. Can you call me when you're free? A few bumps. I laughed out loud. The kind of laugh that felt like finally exhaling after a long dive. A few bumps. As if what they were experiencing was a mild inconvenience. As if the foundation hadn't just been pulled from beneath their entire operation. I didn't reply. Instead, I watched as another alert ticked onto my panel. Audit schedule flagged. Incomplete signatory credentials. That one would sting. The government didn't care about transitions or family ties or who looked good in a suit. They cared about signatures. And mine no longer counted for them. Which meant neither did theirs. I leaned on the balcony rail and watched the clouds move slowly over the skyline. I wasn't gloating. This wasn't revenge. It was consequence. They thought they could erase the man and keep the machinery. That they could change the name on the door without checking who built the hinges. Now they were learning. And I had front row seats. Bianca's voice came through the voicemail like a gust of forced calm. Hey James. I know things got off to a rocky start, but we're just trying to realign some processes. No hard feelings, okay? Give me a call when you can. We could use a bit of guidance navigating the portals. Translation. The house was burning, and now she was trying to learn where the fire extinguisher was stored after firing the man who built it. I let the voicemail sit. I didn't need to hear the rest. The panic was already bleeding through the cracks. They'd assumed I was just a switch. Flip me off, reroute power, move on. But I wasn't a switch. I was the grid, and no one else had the keys. Later that morning, I heard from someone I didn't expect, Lexi, Bianca's executive assistant. She sent me an email with the subject line, "Quick question on compliance portal." I opened it out of morbid curiosity. Short and sweet. Hi James, hope you're well. Quick thing, Bianca asked if you could clarify how to change ownership of the federal compliance dashboard credentials. We're trying to assign them to me or Marco. Shouldn't be too hard, right? Let me know what steps we need. Thanks. Smiley face. I stared at the screen for a full minute. Lexi. The same Lexi who once thought HIPAA was a typo. The one who ordered lattes during OSHA briefings and called the supply closet the vibe zone. Now she thought she could just log into a portal I spent 6 years integrating with biometric authentication, dual key encryption, and multi-agency verification protocols. built intentionally to prevent exactly this kind of shallow handover. She thought she could inherit it like a Dropbox folder. I didn't reply. They tried to log in, of course. I saw the attempt on the system monitor. The digital equivalent of a toddler trying to guess the passcode to the Pentagon. The result was immediate. Access denied. Invalid owner ID. Credential holder not recognized. And when they tried to change it, that was better. Bianca likely walked into the room, clutching her phone, saying, "Just update the profile. Change the license holder to Marco or Lexi. That's all." But the system wasn't built for profile updates. It was built for protection. To change the credential owner, the process required a biometric handover, fingerprint scan, voice print verification, a 6-week vetting period through 3 federal agencies, and written consent from the original holder, which, let's be very clear, I would never provide. They tried anyway. Error. Tried again. Error. And then the lockout timer activated. I got the ping at 11:23 a.m. The system had registered 3 failed credential handovers in under 2 hours. That meant the federal dashboard was now frozen, secured until further verification or audit clearance. I had built that feature after a scare 3 years ago when a junior associate had almost clicked the wrong submission file. I never told anyone it existed. Why would I? Security isn't about what people know. It's about what they don't realize until it's too late. I refreshed my monitoring tab. Status, federal dashboard, locked, state license sync, disabled, vendor API, restricted, FDA chain of custody, error 042, internal reporting, invalid compliance anchor. It was all coming undone. And still, they kept trying. Bianca was used to being the smartest person in a room full of people too polite to challenge her. She'd skate by on charisma and strategy decks, assuming every system could be charmed or bypassed. But systems don't care about charm. And credentials don't care about your last name. When she couldn't get through the portals, she started pushing tasks onto Lexi. Poor girl. I imagined her hunched over Marco's laptop, clicking through error screens, chewing her lip as more messages came back blocked. The federal compliance portal, in particular, was stubborn, and I had made sure of that. I remember the night I first designed the upgrade. The old system was too easy to reroute. One form, a few signatures, and you could shift control of the whole network. I'd been up until 2 a.m. drafting a new protocol, one that linked credential ownership to biometric encryption, ID registration across multiple government bodies, and a unique sequence token only accessible via dual-channel verification. A system designed for continuity, but not convenience, especially not for outsiders. It was perfectly legal, perfectly airtight, and now perfectly unmovable. Lexi tried calling the helpline. I know, because I still had a legacy flag on my name that alerted me whenever my former ID number was mentioned in a support inquiry. I got the transcript ping at 2:14 p.m. "Hello, this is Lexi from Weller Group. We need to reassign federal compliance dashboard credentials to a new user. Who is the current listed license holder? James Langley. Do you have signed transfer authorization? He doesn't work here anymore. I'm sorry, ma'am." Then the credential chain is currently inactive and ineligible for reassignment without recertification. Can't we just request access? No, ma'am. You'll need to start the full certification cycle. 6 to 8 weeks minimum, assuming you pass verification. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. 6 to 8 weeks. Bianca thought she was building momentum. But what she was really doing was sprinting face-first into a wall I had mortared together with every ounce of quiet foresight she underestimated. Because I knew this day would come. Maybe not exactly like this, but some version of it. I'd seen too many fast climbers, people who thought ambition was a substitute for depth, who thought titles trumped infrastructure. Bianca was just another name on the list now. And every time they clicked another broken link, they weren't just failing to access a system, they were running into the ghost of every ignored warning I had ever gently delivered in a report she never read. By the end of the day, I had one more ping on my panel. New notification, compliance credential recertification request denied. Applicant unverified. Lexi had tried to apply herself. God bless her optimism. The form was returned, rejected. The reason? No prior compliance experience. No credential basis. No qualifying employment history in regulatory operations. Because the system didn't care that she sat next to Bianca in meetings. It cared about history, credentials, legitimacy. I stood, stretched my arms over my head, and turned off my monitor. The sun was dipping low behind the skyline. I watched the light fade into amber streaks across glass towers, and I smiled. They had tried to take my role. Now they were learning that the role had teeth. And it wasn't going to bite them. It was going to starve them, quietly. It was 8:42 a.m. on a Friday when Franklin Weller returned, tan, smug, and oblivious. Fresh off a 3-week yacht excursion in the Adriatic, he strolled into the lobby wearing linen slacks, boat shoes, and a blue polo shirt that still smelled like saltwater arrogance. That man never met a crisis he didn't assume could be resolved by a firm handshake or a "let's circle back." I wasn't there, but I could picture it vividly. He probably tipped his sunglasses down at the front desk, winked at the receptionist, and said something like, "Hope nobody crashed the ship while the captain was out." It would have gotten a polite chuckle most days. Not that day. Because the ship hadn't just crashed, it had lost its anchor, its engine, and its legal authority to operate in federal waters. And Bianca, his daughter, had been at the helm. He breezed past everyone like a man who still thought the walls would lean to greet him. I imagined his stride, unbothered, swinging his leather satchel like a man preparing for a day of power lunches and delegation. Then he reached the executive floor, and the quiet swallowed him. His inbox must have been the first shock. Hundreds of alerts. All red. All screaming in caps. Federal noncompliance warnings. Audit failures. Blocked vendor transactions. Expired license notifications from every agency we were tied to. I had set it up that way, quietly, years ago. So the top brass wouldn't just get updates. They'd get alarms. Systemic collapses weren't meant to whisper. By 9:03 a.m., he had read enough. The first person he called was legal. The second was Bianca. I could only imagine the storm that hit her office. He would have barged in, still holding his phone, voice pitched somewhere between outrage and confusion. Why the hell is every contract frozen? Why are we getting flagged for expired registrations? And who the hell did we just fire? It wouldn't have taken long before someone muttered my name. I wasn't the kind of man Franklin ever truly saw. I was just the guy who made problems disappear. Licenses filed on time, audits passed with flying colors, contractors cleared, vendors paid, certifications updated before anyone even realized they were nearing expiration. Franklin never asked how it got done, only that it stayed done. That was the deal we'd always had. Unspoken, but ironclad. Until Bianca. She saw the invisible and decided to call it irrelevant. Franklin never expected to return from sailing to find the engine room stripped bare. And now, his pride, the family business, was being strangled by legal protocols he barely understood. That was the real pain for a man like him. Not the failure, but the helplessness. I was told by a former colleague, who still checked in from time to time, that the boardroom that morning was a circus. Franklin summoned every available senior officer. He wanted answers. Instead, he got panicked shrugs and deflections. Legal had already pulled my personnel file. By 10:15 a.m., Clause 9C had been printed, underlined, and placed in front of him. He read it 3 times. Then again. It was all there, in bold, permanent ink. All certifications funded by the company shall be considered legally void upon the signer's involuntary termination. The room went silent. I knew it would, because that line didn't just void paperwork. It severed the business's entire operational legitimacy. Without those certifications, they couldn't transact, couldn't fulfill contracts, couldn't even apply for routine renewals. And then came the question I knew was coming. Who approved this clause? The answer, of course, was Franklin himself. Years ago, I had negotiated that addendum during a restructuring push. Everyone else was too focused on trimming costs and flattening departments. No one batted an eye when the compliance officer asked for a little extra language. Why would they? I wasn't a threat. I was quiet, consistent, boring. But that day, boring became nuclear. Franklin reportedly slammed the folder down, his face mottled red. I would have paid good money to watch that moment. The precise instant when the man realized the daughter he trusted to modernize the firm had accidentally fired the one person keeping the whole damn operation federally legal. You fired the license, he said. That line made it back to me. Multiple sources. Different tones. Same impact. Not, you fired James. Not, you fired your brother-in-law. You fired the license. Because that's what I was. To them. To her. An asset. A checkbox. Something to attach to their name until they no longer saw the need. Now that need was crashing down on them like a lead curtain. I wondered what Bianca's face looked like when she realized it. The truth has a way of landing with its own gravity. It doesn't need to scream, it just settles into the room and crushes everything under it. I imagined her sitting there, still trying to talk her way out of it, her voice pitched too high, her logic unraveling. Franklin wasn't the type to suffer mistakes quietly, especially not from family, and especially not when those mistakes cost him contracts, capital, and credibility. By noon, the whole firm knew. My phone buzzed again. Texts, missed calls, even a LinkedIn message from someone in risk management. James, I think they're about to offer you a consultancy. Franklin looks like he aged 10 years and 10 minutes. I didn't respond. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was clarity. For 12 years, I had done the invisible work, the kind that never got applauded in town halls or mentioned in glossy year-end reviews. But without it, they were exposed, vulnerable, legally inert. And now they understood. Finally. I turned my phone over and stepped outside. The air smelled sharper, cleaner, like something old had been cut away. Franklin had come home, but the house he left behind? It wasn't his anymore. It didn't take long for the realization to spread. Like smoke curling under a doorframe, silent, subtle, then suddenly choking everyone in the room. By Monday, Bianca's voice had lost its upward lilt. The pep talks were gone. Her walk had changed to less of the confident strut, more of a defensive shuffle. The firm no longer moved around her. It moved through her, like a bypass. A formality. And even that wouldn't last long. She had tried to frame it as a hiccup, a learning curve, even a necessary transition. But the numbers weren't a hiccup. The emails weren't a transition. This wasn't a glitch. It was a full-blown hemorrhage. Contracts frozen. Vendors pulling out. Government agencies sending non-compliance alerts faster than they could be ignored. And in the middle of it all was the echo of a name they had tried to erase from the conversation. Mine. Franklin had stopped being gentle the moment he saw the full audit report. I wasn't there, obviously, but the boardroom had its leaks. And they flowed fast. I heard that legal sat in stunned silence as Bianca tried to explain away the voided certifications. We thought we could just transfer his credentials, she said. A whisper. That's how it was described to me. Not a confident presentation. Not an executive decision. A whisper, barely audible under the weight of a collapsing firm. I could imagine her then, seated at the end of the table, still trying to wear power like a blazer that no longer fit. Her words crumpling before they left her mouth. Franklin had paced, apparently. That's what he does when he's furious and trying not to yell. Walks tight circles like a man wrestling a demon just under his skin. At some point, he slapped his palm on the table hard enough to make someone flinch. You thought, he barked. You thought. No one spoke after that. The silence in that room must have been unbearable. I know that silence well. It's the same kind that used to fill my office when I found a licensing error buried under layers of someone else's shortcuts. The kind that feels like a slow exhale right before you decide whether to fix something or burn it all down. That day, they realized they had chosen fire. The irony of it all was almost poetic. For years, I had made myself small to keep things running. I'd been the background noise to their forward motion. The man who just handled it. No applause. No recognition. Just quiet continuity. And now, that same quiet was devouring them. Franklin demanded to see the termination file. He wanted every clause, every signature, every legal stitch. And when they handed him the folder, it was Clause 9C that stopped him. He read it aloud. I know because someone from HR called me later, off the record, just to say they'd never seen him so furious. All certifications funded by the company shall be considered legally void upon the signer's involuntary termination. He said it like it was an incantation, like speaking it out loud might undo it. But it couldn't. Because I didn't write that clause out of pettiness or spite. I wrote it because I knew the value of what I carried. I knew what it meant to hold authority that no one else understood. And I knew that eventually, someone would come along too arrogant or too ignorant to realize what would happen if they cut the cord. Franklin turned to Bianca then. I wasn't there, but I've imagined it often. His face a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. You fired the license. Those 4 words didn't just land, they detonated. Because that's all I ever was to them, in the end. A license. A gatekeeper to the one thing they never bothered to learn. The invisible systems that made them look competent. Bianca tried to say something else. Probably some bland defense about restructuring, agility, or whatever buzzword was trending that week. But there's a tone people take on when they realize they've made an irreversible mistake. It's part denial, part begging. And everyone in the room could hear it. The legal team started scrambling, searching for a loophole, a reversal clause, anything. But I'd written Clause 9C to be watertight, bulletproof, and notarized in a way that not even Franklin could bend with his name or his money. Termination meant nullification. Plain and simple. Meanwhile, Bianca's reputation began to curl in on itself like scorched paper. Every new alert was a fresh indictment. Internal systems were crumbling. Client complaints were stacking, and the dashboards, those beautiful, color-coded compliance dashboards, were still frozen on one status: inactive, NO authorized license holder. That was the part one had designed with care, because I knew they would check. I knew they'd try to click past the warning, try to pretend it wasn't as bad as it looked. But I made sure it was. Made sure every locked panel, every grayed-out field, every blank authorization box screamed the same thing. James Langley was here, and now he's not. I didn't rejoice. Not exactly. But I felt the shift. The satisfaction of being seen, not through applause or promotion, but through absence. Through consequence. Bianca stopped contacting me by Tuesday. The texts had gone from professional to polite to pitiful, and then they just stopped. No apology. No accountability. Just silence. And it was fitting, really, because she never saw me as necessary until she couldn't function without me. And by then, it was too late. Franklin, for his part, never reached out. He wouldn't. Men like him don't say sorry. They just try to fix it with money or silence or both. And that suited me fine, because I had already moved on from them. They could keep their silence. I already had everything else. The email came at 2:18 p.m. The subject line was desperate in its restraint, opportunity to collaborate, immediate, but the body made no effort to hide what it really was. An olive branch dressed in a consultant's blazer and wrapped in the sort of language you only use when the foundation is cracking beneath you. James, we deeply value your expertise and would like to extend a 6-month consulting offer. Premium salary. Full discretion. We're open to negotiation. Looking forward to reconnecting. The Weller Group leadership team, it didn't even say, "Dear Mr. Langley." Not even the basic courtesy of a formal greeting. Just James. As if that familiarity could smooth over the way they shoved me out with a memo and a packet. As if the same hands that boxed me up and sunset my position now expected me to forget what they'd done. What struck me most wasn't the offer itself. It was the tone. Measured panic. Carefully worded surrender. You could smell the boardroom fear in every line. Someone, maybe Franklin himself, had finally done the math. Compliance failure equals breached contracts, which equals lawsuits, which equals a financial hemorrhage that even yacht equity can't plug. But I didn't reply immediately. No, I wanted the silence to speak for a while. Let them sit in the limbo of no response. Let them wonder if the man they discarded would bail them out or bury them. I went for a walk. Let the city noise pass through me like static. I got a tea from the place on 12th where no one knew my name. I watched pigeons squabble over a crust of bread and thought, how poetic. By the time I got home, another email had arrived. This time, directly from Franklin. James, I understand there have been some breakdowns since your departure. Let's put the past aside. We'd appreciate your help resolving the current challenges. Name your terms. Best, Franklin Weller. That best felt like acid. The last time Franklin emailed me directly, it was to thank me for a flawless audit in Baltimore. 3 years ago. I remember because he signed that one with a cheerful "appreciate you." Now he was back, but not with gratitude. With necessity. He needed me. Not just a consultant. Me. And that made all the difference. I opened a blank reply, stared at the blinking cursor, and let the words form slowly, clean, direct, surgical. Franklin, I don't return to collapsed buildings. Please find attached. Confirmation of license nullification, screenshot of your inactive dashboard, list of client contracts now in breach due to invalid compliance pathways, wishing you luck and litigation. James Langley. I read it twice, made no edits, and hit send. There was no catharsis in it. No triumphant music swelling in the background. Just clarity. Control. A line drawn with precision, not spite. Because this wasn't about revenge, it was about boundaries. For years, I had kept the lights on while everyone else played spotlight. I'd made it easy for them to forget how much they relied on me. Now, I was making it impossible to ignore. A minute after sending the email, I received the read receipt. 5 minutes later, I got another message shorter this time. James, we understand. If circumstances change, our door remains open. I deleted it because I had no intention of walking back through that door. Not when I had already stepped into a better one. What they didn't know, what they hadn't bothered to ask, was that I was already 3 weeks into contract negotiations with Novex Systems. A company that understood compliance wasn't just a checkbox, but the backbone. They'd reached out after the first wave of Weller's glitches went public. I declined to comment, of course, professional discretion and all, but I didn't need to explain the disaster. The industry was watching. And I was the man who hadn't said a word during the storm. That silence? It had value. Novex had seen it. They offered me a corner office, a team that actually read the reports I wrote, and best of all, a leadership team that didn't ask what OSHA stood for in the interview. My start date was already locked. My onboarding was clean. My fingerprints had barely dried on their federal registry forms when Franklin sent his email. Too late. And the irony? The timing wasn't just poetic. It was deliberate. I'd waited for them to hit their wall, waited for them to realize what they threw away. Now, they were scrambling for the same man who used to be invisible. I printed the email, not because I needed it, but because some moments deserve to be held in paper, to sit in a drawer as a reminder of exactly how the arc bent back in your favor. Later that night, I sat on my balcony, sipping a glass of ginger tea, watching the skyline blink with its quiet confidence. Somewhere across those towers was Franklin, was Bianca, was a company that once thought legacy was disposable and experience was optional. Now they were knee-deep in legal calls and compliance appeals. And me? I was already gone. 3 weeks later, I posted the update on LinkedIn. Camera with flash James Langley, Director of Compliance, Novex Systems. Caption: grateful to be part of a team that understands integrity isn't a trend. Just like that, the silence ended. Not with noise, not with fireworks, but with a polished photo, a clean title, and a single sentence that said everything without naming names. It didn't need to. Everyone who mattered already knew. The industry watched what happened at Weller Group the way onlookers study a train derailment. Quiet fascination, corporate caution, whispered warnings passed between firms. And now I was standing in the aftermath with something better: clarity, stability, respect. Novex didn't just welcome me. They handed me the keys to build what I'd always envisioned, a compliance ecosystem rooted in foresight, not panic. My team was sharp, eager, and none of them had a sister named Bianca. That alone felt like a promotion. The office was on the 14th floor, corner unit, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the lake. I hadn't asked for the view, but they gave it to me anyway. Said it matched the scale of what I was bringing. I'd been in that office for less than 2 weeks when the first call came through. An old Weller client asking if I'd consider onboarding them under Novex. Just a few lingering delays over at Weller, they said. Figured we'd reach out to someone who actually knows what they're doing. I didn't gloat. I didn't even blink. I handed them off to our client onboarding lead and marked the call complete. 3 days later, another Weller client followed. Then another. By the end of week 3, Novex had signed 3 major contracts that once sat under my old firm's umbrella. And unlike Weller, we didn't miss a beat onboarding them. Every license was already in place. Every process already vetted. My fingerprints were everywhere, and this time, they were welcomed. The dashboard Weller lost? Still flagged. Their systems were technically online, but hollow. Functioning in theory, crippled in practice. I'd been told, through whispers and non-disclosures, that Bianca had been quietly reassigned. No public memo. No farewell party. Just a calendar that suddenly stopped listing her meetings. I imagined her packing up her desk in silence, that glossy ambition of hers now dulled by the weight of consequence. I had no desire to follow up, to check on her, to gloat. I had nothing to prove to Bianca anymore. She had been her own undoing. The only thing I left behind for her was the void she created. Franklin, from what I'd gathered, was juggling more than he could handle. Internal audits, board pressure, legal reviews. He'd tried to regain control of the narrative, but there's no memo that undoes a federal deactivation. There's no press release that masks a leadership error of that scale. Novex didn't need a story about revenge. We had results. My results. I had a functioning espresso machine, a team that read policy drafts before sending them back, and no one, absolutely no one, called me legacy overhead. That term had haunted me once, lingering in my chest like dust from a closed vent. Now, it made me smirk. Every morning when I arrived at Novex, the front desk greeted me by name. The door badge blinked green without hesitation. My password worked on the first try. The printer didn't jam. And most importantly, my ideas weren't met with blank stares or executive interruptions. People listened. People asked questions. People understood what it meant to hold the keys before asking to borrow the car. One afternoon, while sorting through a revised draft of our compliance model for digital asset vendors, I pulled a sticky note from my drawer. It was the only thing I'd taken from my old office before leaving. Yellow, square, a little worn from time. I had stuck it above my monitor at Weller once, quietly, after a particularly frustrating meeting with Bianca and Marco, in case they ever forget. I was the license. I pressed the note gently to the corner of my Novex monitor. It wasn't a declaration anymore. It was a reminder of where I'd been, of what I'd survived, of the weight I had carried for people who never once thought to say thank you. Now, I didn't need their gratitude. I had my own foundation, my own space, my own silence, sharpened into clarity. There were moments I wondered what would have happened if they had treated me differently. If Bianca had walked into that office and said, "I want to learn from you," instead of trying to replace me. If Franklin had valued infrastructure over optics. But those thoughts never lingered long. Regret has no place in progress. What mattered was the rebuild. And I had rebuilt something worth standing in. People like Bianca think power is loud. That it comes from the title, the spotlight, the sound of your name echoing in glass boardrooms. But real power? It's quiet. It's what happens when systems work because you planned for failure before anyone saw it coming. It's in the peace of knowing you can walk away and the house collapses not because you burned it, but because you were the beams they never noticed. Now I was the architect of a new structure. At Novex, I wasn't invisible. I was essential, and not just because of the licenses I held, but because of the lessons I carried with them. The kind no MBA course, no viral TED Talk, no startup buzzword could replace. Integrity isn't a trend. It's a blueprint. I live by it now. And when I looked out over the skyline from my corner office, the city didn't look hostile anymore. It looked earned.